now. We will start in about 2 minutes. We still have quite a few people coming in. There are some instructions on the screen now if you want to turn off the notifications of people entering the screen or entering the conversation now. And we'll start in just a minute or two. Thank you. Okay, I think just looking at that many people have now arrived, so I think we can go ahead and begin. So hello everyone, and welcome to this second debate in the Debating Development series. This year is the 17th edition of this debate series, and due to the pandemic, we are organizing it online. The first debate last week on post-development and decolonial perspectives with Achille Mbembe and Els Ertoga was very well attended, and for those who were not able to attend, you can go to the website and there is a link to the recorded video. Last week's debate set out some key issues in relation to what decolonization can mean for the development sector. And today we will dive a little bit deeper into how decolonial perspectives can inform us about making sense of global environmental crises and responses to them. So a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Vijay Kolinjivadi. I am a postdoc researcher at the Institute of Development Policy at the University of Antwerp. And I'm extremely honored to be able to moderate this event, the event this evening. And I'm speaking to you today as a settler on the unceded territory and traditional meeting place of the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples on the island of Tiohtià:ke, known to some as Montreal, in so-called Canada. So before I present both speakers to you, I'd like to take a few minutes to give you some more context about this series, the overarching topic for tonight's discussion, as well as some brief overview as to how the discussion will unfold. Debating Development is a yearly series of events organized at the University of Antwerp as a partnership between the Institute of Development Policy and the University Foundation for Development Cooperation. The series is both an interfaculty course for students at our university, and at the same time, it is a public event that is open to a broader audience. The subject of today's debate, or discussion I should say, is of utmost importance as climate change, species, and ecological breakdown more accelerate in step with the development that has historically and continues to be premised upon systemic exploitation of racialized people, of land dispossession for resource extraction, and the extirpation of a plurality of relations between people and their living and non-living environments. The mainstream development model has been premised on the sustained project of eradicating indigenous ways of knowing, whose own worlds and worldviews have in some cases already experienced what Anishinaabe scholar Lawrence Gross has called an apocalyptic event. The aftermath of upheavals wrought by colonial violence in the name of a universal understanding of progress. Appreciating how ecologies emerge requires contextualizing ecological relations historically and geographically embedded. This means paying attention to the planetary process that emerged from the so-called Enlightenment era, establishment of imperial empires and subsequently through globalization premised upon the simplification of environment, replication of landscapes to match especially European analogs around the world, and increasing control and calculability in dominating all aspects of life. So I'd like to take a moment now to briefly introduce our speakers this evening, for which we're really excited to be able to have with us for this conversation. Our keynote is Dr. Diana Vela Almeida, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the geography department at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, Norway, and a member of the Collective of Critical Geography in Ecuador. She combines political ecology, ecological economics, and critical geography to study extractivism, neoliberal environmentalism, and economic transitions, socio-environmental resistance, and social transformation in Latin America and also in Indonesia. After Diana's keynote, we invite Daniel Ribeiro as a discussant from Justicia Ambiental and Friends of the Earth, Mozambique, who will reflect upon challenges of working towards the goal of decolonizing ecology from within the conservation sector. Justicia Ambiental, meaning environmental justice in Portuguese, is one of the leading civil society nonprofit organizations in Mozambique. Daniel has been an activist for over 22 years, ever since he, and along with other citizens, formed a grassroots movement that opposed and successfully ended a Danish-funded toxic waste incinerator project that was planned in their neighborhood in Matola, Mozambique. So just a quick note on how this will work. First, we will give the floor to Diana, who will give a keynote of about 30 to 35 minutes. When there's about 5 minutes left, I'll give a sign. After that, we immediately give the floor to Daniel Ribeiro, who will have about 20 minutes to provide some reflections. And then we'll have time for some questions. More particularly, our students have been asked to read a text that was suggested by the speakers, and on the basis of that text, they have submitted some specific questions as well. All of you will also have the chance to ask some questions at the end. Just seeing a message here, 1 second. I hope you can all hear me still. Let me see. So you will all have the chance to ask some questions at the end, and we will later show you where you can post these questions. So in the meantime, we ask that you write down your questions, and then later on, you'll be able to submit them through an online system, in which people will also get the chance to vote for the most relevant questions. So we know it's not really ideal, but in these circumstances, we think that it's the best or the most democratic way to deal with the questions. And finally, for those who feel the urge to use Twitter, you can refer to this debate by using the hashtag DEVDEV, D-E-V-D-E-V. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our keynote speaker, Diana Vela Almeida.
Hello everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Diana.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. I'd like to thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to this seminar. I'm really happy to be here and eager to learn. Also, looking forward to have this super engaging discussion with Daniel. So, IOB has invited me to talk about decolonizing ecological relations. And when preparing for this talk, I have to admit that the opportunity to talk about decolonization certainly comes with a degree of accountability from myself as as an academic activist in regards of the narratives that I'm presenting here. And I also want to say that talking about decolonizing ecological relations, as the organizers have called this today's seminar, is a complex issue. So I'm not sure that I'll be able to tackle the whole complexity of it, of if there is any single way to understand decolonizing ecological relations. Because such a complex and politically charged question needs to be discussed largely with the people affected the most by colonialism. So my task here is merely to attempt to discuss how colonialism is entangled in our relationships with nature and revise some of the claims peoples and nationalities have already demanded for years. Finally, I'm situating this talk closely to the experience of colonialism and decolonization in Latin America. Yet I recognize that colonialism extends to other frontiers of sacrifice. The capitalistic system of accumulation and dispossession takes place in peoples and communities in the global south as well as in the global north. So first, I'd like to outline colonialism in its historical context. So colonialism relates to an enterprise that reproduces violence, exploitation, usurpation of lands, and annihilation of bodies in order to own economic, political, and cultural domination of colonizers through ever-increasing extractive frontiers. Here I'd like to distinguish colonialism from coloniality. So colonialism or settler colonialism is a historical global process that not only involves cultural and symbolic dispossession, but also the usurpation of the living conditions of indigenous and Black people, resulting in slavery, the looting of land, the domination of nature, and the change in the relations between plants, animals, and the unearthed rocks and minerals, all with the purpose of erasing other forms of life and being. On the other hand, coloniality, again to be distinguished from colonialism, was coined in the 90s by Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist. So for him, coloniality is an expression that embodies the system of hegemonic power that emerged from the European colonial time, was imposed worldwide through the paradigm of the modernity, to think about progress. So Quijano claims that modernity is a system of thinking and social organization that establishes relations of domination to nature and other humans, and disregards other existing worldviews. Both colonialism and coloniality are defined by the colonial time and can help us both to understand the processes of world system transformations that took place since the 16th century and their influence over the lives of peoples and the relations societies have with nature. So last week, if you remember, was October 12th. And so for the whole American continent, we remember the long and violent episode of the conquest of the Americas in the 1492. And for us as Latin Americans, this historical date is appalling because it marks the beginning of 6 centuries of political, economic, and social and cultural upheavals, not only throughout the continent, but also is important because it influenced the colonial geopolitics around the world. At the end of the day, all of us are marked by colonialism. We're the descendant of thousands of violent acts against indigenous people, and they translate to today's racial, political, and economic divisioning. So ingrained is the power of colonialism in our geography that my mother tongue is the language of the colonizer. And it is the language of collective identity as most Latin Americans. Colonialism is a good starting point to think about the series of events that have led to the ecological crisis we face today, where life itself is at risk. So for European civilizational project, as it is colonialism, it wrote a new chapter of separation between what is European civility and the wilderness, a separation between the sacred lives, white saber, and the so-called heathens of the hinterlands, a division between the saving civilization versus letting it succumb to barbarism. And Horacio Machado mentions colonialism marked the separation between society, and not any type of society, but white, violent men's society, as a subject, and nature as an object to be militarized, commodified, raped, and annihilated. Colonization was a violent, patriarchal enterprise dominated by white males that were entitled to take land, kill people, raped indigenous women. And even after colonial times, the independent new republics and their corresponding states were governed by economic elites as heirs of the colonial regimes. So they continued the exploitation of nature for wealth accumulation, and this by turn meant the continued racialization and gender construction of bodies, as well as the objectification of today's nature. So we can start our point of departure for understanding the ecological crisis in the colonization, because it reconfigured the historical production of nature, where land again is usurped and bodies alienated. Nature becomes this colonial object to be dominated, and the relationship between people and nature is transformed materially and symbolically, both. So when I say materially, it is because this new world became the provider of raw materials required for European empires to run their social metabolisms for economic growth, and also luxurious opulence of the gentry and the royalty. Eduardo Galeano, if some of you might have read, he wrote this wonderful book called The Open Veins of Latin America, where he illustrates the role that Cerro Rico in the Bolivian Potosi had in the trans-hemispheric looting of silver that shaped the economy in the world system of the 16th century. The exploitation of precious metals is entangled in an economy of plunder, looting, and slavery, that continue with the plantation and monoculture of sugar, cotton, coffee, cocoa, tobacco, and so on, to today's extractive economies that we see as the agro-industry, fisheries, oil, gas, mining, among others. And symbolically, because colonialism also created the economic shift as a system of production that was no longer centered on livelihoods and economic for sustaining the living conditions of people, but instead it became a system of exploitation of commodities, accumulation of wealth, and never-ending growth on a presumed infinite planet. This also created a system of knowledge where nature becomes everything that fills the coffers of the colonizers, with the profit motive being the ultimate good. Ultimately, colonialism has built structures of privilege and forms of economic patriarchal and xenophobic power that have corrupted the world system for the last 6 centuries. Colonialism was and remains a territorialized global enterprise of domination of land and of human and not human bodies. And since in its inception, it came disguised by the ideas of science, reason, the imperial discoveries, and intellectual and sacred transformations for the betterment of humanity and for progress. The era of imperial discoveries is a time of exploration, appropriation, and exploitation of the wealth of nature, its soils, its crops, its animals and plants, its minerals and metals, where nature itself could be studied and manipulated without any moral consequence. Indeed, the science, including here ecology, biology, geography, contributed to this project by creating systems of knowledge that allowed land enclosures, the treatment of intricate ecological relations into fixed parameters, and the legibility of elements of nature as passive objects that can be modeled in cause-effect ways. The result has been the transformation of ecological and climate patterns and the overall creation of an ideology based on human ingenuity and exceptionalism over nature. The relationship between colonialism and the production of nature is so profound that post-colonial historian Dipesh Chakrabarty has said that climate change is not a collateral effect of colonialism and modernity, but it is its target and aim. Colonialism has re-engineered the climate to alter harsh climate conditions and transform the soil, while killing plants and animals and putting in contradictions the existence of minerals and the preservation of life. So to reflect upon ecological relations, I think it is important to remember that any economic and political discussion has a foundational ecological reference, as it is the basis for life of humans and non-humans. In other words, the global societal relations are in fact ecological relations because societies are physiologically, economically, and spiritually interdependent with the biosphere. So that is why I like to engage with the concept of world ecology, which views our current colonial and capitalist mode of production and consumption not as separate entities of the economy, but as intricate processes that transform and are transformed by the biophysical world. As I have mentioned, the production of nature has an ideological basis in colonialism and has marked the existence of a dualism between society and nature, where nature is to be controlled, commodified, and discarded. Still, all ex-colonies to today continue to be seen as a source of material and energy input for the voracious growth regime of industrialized societies in Europe, North America, and China mainly, but also increasingly for the expansion of the upper classes in developing countries. And also, these ex-colonies are being the repository of their endless production of global waste. This relationship with nature is made most striking by the global environmental crisis. Today's global pandemic has come to characterize the already existing environmental struggles in the daily lives of millions of people worldwide. These people that are poor and racialized communities, people affected by pollution, droughts, fires, deforestation, agricultural lands removed from their soil biodiversity, rising ocean levels, heat waves, hurricanes, and now pandemics. Yet, most solutions to the environmental crisis do not consider marginalized voices. And they are the ones that are most affected by the crisis. There is ample discussions about the need for societal solutions, including energy transitions and a Green Deal. So, for example, Europe has now its Green Deal, but there is not much discussion about how the energetic transformation of Europe will depend the raw materials for green technology that come precisely from their ex-colonies, countries that are considered as resource-rich nations. So then I will ask, is it the history that is continuing again and again and again? Last week, Nemonte Menquino, a Guarani woman who lives in the Ecuadorian Amazon and who led her indigenous organization to win a legal case against oil concessions in their territories, became one of the 100 most influential people by Time magazine. And so last week she published in The Guardian, where she states, and I quote, "You forced your civilization upon us, and now look where we are. Global pandemic, climate crisis, species extinction, and driving it all, widespread spiritual poverty. In all these years of taking from our lands, you have not had the courage or the curiosity or the respect to get to know us." She later says, You're probably not used to an indigenous woman calling you ignorant, but for indigenous people, it is clear. The less you know about something, the less value it has to you, and the easier it is to destroy. And by easy, I mean guiltlessly, remorselessly, foolishly, even righteously. And this is exactly what you're doing to us as indigenous peoples, to our rainforest territories, and ultimately to our climate planet. In the last few years, indigenous Amazonian women have been at the forefront of the resistance against the expansion of 21st century neocolonialism in the form of extractive projects that are destroying their body territories. This movement has become even more powerful as their struggles are they are not against self-contained nation states, but rather a fight for the protected Amazonian as a bioregion, and by turns the entire planet as the medium for protecting the living conditions. It is not a coincidence then that for the ex-colonies, that those are the current regions where they have the highest number of land defenders being killed. A shocking report of Global Witness highlighted last year there was 212 land and environmental defenders being killed, mostly in Latin America. This is not only a manifestation of the necropolitics that are at play by the state, but also what Rita Segato would call para-violence. So this is the type of violence that happens in the state, but also in the border outside of the state. In Brazil, for example, militia groups supported by far-right fascist Jair Bolsonaro are now embodying the feeling of pride that held by the conquistadores and the subsequent military incursions of post-independence dictatorships that and are strategically promoting extractive industries to encroach indigenous territories with the explicit intention to place indigenous populations in danger of extermination. COVID-19 has been an excellent justification to keep this process of extermination, just as the epidemics and famines that resulted from the arrival of the Spanish colonizers in indigenous territories during the 16th century. COVID has now been utilized as a war machine to find new ways of dispossessing indigenous peoples from their lands and eliminating their knowledge, as the most vulnerable to this disease are indigenous elders that are dying. So knowing the horrendous acts of colonialism that persist today, the minimum absolute response is to oppose to these perversities by raising deep awareness of the historical structures of colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy that exist today. This has been of utmost importance for post-colonial, decolonial, and decolonization work. So that is why I like to attempt, and again I stress only attempt, to explain what decolonizing ecological relations could look like. First, decolonization is not a category of self-identification. It is a relational category tied to specific histories of domination and exploitation, and based upon an ongoing lived struggle between colonizers and colonized. It fundamentally requires looking at the historical and geopolitical multi-scale and transhemispherical relations of power asymmetries that continue to exist in today's society. Therefore, decolonization must always be contextualized to a specific geography of history of violence, as they reflect material and cultural dispossession of people, their non-human kin, and their collective worldviews. Decolonization is not a Manichaean dispute solely based upon phenotypic bodies or geographical locations, nor it is about embracing neoliberal multiculturalism that does not dispute class, gender, and racial superiority. It is about confronting the process of dispossession, violence, and death that has happened and continues to happen to racialized others. Decolonization is not about bringing back an essentialized and romanticized indigenous past. Instead, it involves land evolution and self-determination for indigenous peoples and reparation to Afro-descendant communities. For those people whose lands has violently stolen along with their worldviews, devolution and reparation are more than symbolic. They are acts that need to engage with structural injustices and judicial reforms that go beyond economic payouts. Equally, decolonization is much more than inclusion and recognition of cultural and racial diversity. As Adriana Guzman, a communitarian feminist of Aymara origin in Bolivia, claims, the call is not for the respect of our rights, it is about the restitution of historical indigenous practices and the collective memory of communitarian work. These are not symbolic recognitions, but rather demands for historical material grievance and an active call for recovering other human-nature relations. This is important to recognize because part of the violence of Eurocentric institutions and development models is the less visible forms of violence generated by lived experience and cultural dispossession. Decolonization is entangled in the affirmation that development is not a natural law. It is rooted in an understanding that human-nature relations are not the result of random actions. They are a consequence of the reinforcement of a way of living that has concrete ideological basis on modernity and that reproduces an established order with tangible implications for our lives. Decolonization is about reconstructing these relationships and rejecting existing dichotomies that create superiority between people and between people and nature. I believe, however, that decolonization is less about solely unlearning and deconstructing Western knowledge, or it is a critique on modernity alone. But it is more about a serious discussion on how symbolically and materially dismantle colonial, racial, and gender and class oppression that has been historically imposed and permanently reinforced upon people throughout social institutions. This dismantling starts in daily practices and travels to multiple scales of action in the entanglement of the production and reproduction of life. As Eve Tug and Wen Yan would say, decolonization is not a metaphor because settler colonialism is grounded in a specific struggle against an apparatus that has systematically favored colonial Eurocentric models to define legislation, policies, and government institutions under a centralized territorial planning and state-led development. And as I said before, these colonial, racist, and capitalistic apparatuses have resulted in increasing social and environmental injustices. Decolonization calls instead for building relationships based on kin, care, empathy, interdependence, and the warranty of more than human lives. But this is not about having a blueprint, as I said, or a folklorized politics. Instead, it is about embracing the plurality of worldviews and forms of living and being. An important demand has also centered around freedom of movement and the full recognition of societies as historical migrants that too often have been systematically denied of any human condition by jurisdictional colonial forms of the nation state, premised upon racialized forms of human control and elimination in place. Decolonization, then, is not an abstraction, and therefore needs to point to questions such as decolonization where, of what, and to whom and for whom. Ultimately, decolonization reflects multiple forms of territorial-based claims for self-determination that defend spatial practices and build subjects with voice, place, and future. These claims are actually constructed within multi-scalar disputes of power that begin with one one's body. As such, feminist movements in Latin America claim for self-determination of their own bodies as the first territory of defense and resistance. When Adriana Guzman was calling to the restitution of historical practices, she was also referring to abortion. She explains, This is a practice that females of any species have, who can decide when there are times to gestate, when there are times to give birth, and when are times to abort. This way of thinking shows, for example, that there is not any separation between humans and nature. This demand from the feminist movements have become, in the last years, one of the largest mobilizations across the region, because these decisions are also related to the imposition of colonial rationalities that seek to control women's bodies. Indigenous territorial demands for self-determination extend to scales of dispute with the nation state as well, in a call for plurinationality. In the Abya Yala is a term that the indigenous Guna used to replace the imported name of what is considered the American continent. In the Abya Yala, one of the most important demands for indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples is their historical demand for sovereignty and self-determination of their territories beyond the centralized decisions of the nation state. This has become a critical point of departure in transforming the colonial relationship between the state and the indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples. What is crucial here is that plurinationality is not only the recognition of differences, but that the state building ought to be based upon those differences and therefore can no longer be utilitarian for a single conception of being or living. Yet the notion of plurinationality represents a big challenge. Some will say even a contradiction, as the modern nation-state project does little to challenge monocultural colonial structures and to tackle decolonizing pathways that embrace justice for all. This claim for sovereignty and self-determination has also historically extended on global grounds of anti-imperialist and anti-colonial demands against foreign intervention in the sovereign decisions of nations. A call that has unified for years what could be understood as South-South relations. In that sense, colonialism is a global enterprise in expansion that needs to be challenged in terms of its geopolitics. The decolonization of ecological relations then relates both to the locality of the nature-society relationships, but also goes beyond to consider geopolitical ecologies defined by global systems of production and consumption. So in conclusion, I believe decolonizing ecological relations is related to the devolution of the means of living and the restitution of collective practices of elders, peasants, Black and indigenous people that have been materially, symbolically, and politically prevented from making decisions on their own. And then what is our role there? Last week in his fantastic talk, Achille Mbembe mentioned that only people will save themselves. Nobody can outsource their liberation, but we can help to create the conditions of the people's project for liberation and not to generate more obstacles. Thus, there is a clear relevance for recovering a territorially specific and historically focused consciousness in this planetary age, and engaging in a sustained conversation about what restitution, restoration, and reparation in the context of the climate crisis mean for ex-colonies, peasants, indigenous, Blacks, and other marginalized communities. The common ground is the aim to dismantle class, racial, and patriarchal orders that were historically imposed and are permanently reinforced upon us. Decolonizing ecology is a call for claiming back people's voices, practices, knowledge to have their material elements to survive and to build the institutional and cultural conditions that are ultimately resulting in new relations with the soil, with water, and with the climate. This requires recognizing marginalized people as agents that have voice, place, and future. Finally, I'll just end by saying that ecological relations are non-gender, unrace, or unclassed. Therefore, any proposed solution for fighting climate crisis will produce differentiated outcomes to different people. The environmental justice movements know this well. So building just solutions need to be decolonized. And as Token One mentioned already, decolonization is not a metaphor. And I will add, it is not romantic, and it is still a struggle, and it is in permanent political dispute. Thank you.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we hear you, Vijay.
So I think we can give the floor now directly to Danielle, who will reflect on. Go ahead, Danielle.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Sure, we hear you very clearly.
Hi, everyone. So I'll just get a quick background of myself because I don't come from academic background. So terms and the theory is not something that I will be focusing on. And I really liked Diana's presentation because I was as much educated by it as the students on this call. And there's a lot that links up to the work we do and the reality we do. What I'll do is so I work for Justiça Ambiental, Friends of the Earth Mozambique. We're a very small group, about 12 staff. They've been working together for a long time. We don't have offices. We only have one office, and we've been this size for quite a while now, for over 10 years. And it comes down to this notion of growth, this notion that big is better. And do you have a lot of, I think, especially working in the social issues, we link up a lot of struggles on the ground, movements, and people facing a lot of the monsters of the system. And we have to be very sensitive in occupying those spaces. We cannot be the struggle. And that's one reason why we haven't grown and focused on growth. We try and link up with movements on the ground and associations on the ground. I'll be speaking, we have about two main struggles that we're working with. One is the gas in North Mozambique. So one of the largest reserves of gas has been discovered in Mozambique. We're talking about 100 trillion cubic meters. It's one of the biggest. And what this shows is the system hasn't changed. I mean, if you look at this project and what it's caused to the people on the ground, and you go back 100 years and look for a similar project, all the similarities are there. And that's because, and this is all these so-called system fixes. We have EIAs, we have guidelines, corporate responsibility, and the problem is there's nothing to fix in the current system. It is working the way it was designed to work, and it's working too well, actually. And that's the problem. The problem is a lot of these fundamentals cannot be repaired. We need to really look at the broader system issue as well. Whatever you build with the current system is going to have a lot of similarities, and that's something that. So I'll just highlight this with a project that's starting. It's like we are now starting to explore. We haven't built anything. We've already started forcibly moving people out of that area in Mozambique. So there's a few companies. So we have ExxonMobil, Total, Eni. It's a lot of different countries coming in, companies coming into the area. This area is more than 80% are subsistence-based fisher folk or farmers. They have a very direct link to the land. One of the few things they always made very clear: please keep us close to the ocean. Please, we need the land. That's our livelihoods. And what we've seen is the systematic forced removal. We've seen the increase of violence. You've seen the area starting to become since 2017, we've had the extremists attack, and everybody blames on the issue of Islamic extremism. But it's only become, we're forgetting why are suddenly these narratives have so much traction with the population. It is because we took people's land away. It's because we've taken away hope. We've disrespected communities, and a small group has gone down this path. Because when local communities try to develop, try to deal with their problems, try and solve and challenge and raise these issues, they were oppressed. And there's only so much oppression and fear that you can pose on a person before you've taken everything. There's nothing to lose, and the person's going to rise up. And whatever way that rise up, we have to understand no one goes down that path unless pushed to the edge. And this is something that's happening today with all these beautiful corporate responsibility, beautiful little EIAs, and all the apparatus and theater of system fixes. And that's the problem. We have to deal with the fundamentals. We have to go down to the values, our relationship with each other, with nature, with our culture, with our sense of place, our territories. And that was something that was really well put by our keynote speaker. And then we put the broader context of climate change. We are now extracting gas, a fossil fuel. And then we start looking at climate justice. Mozambique is one of the 5 most affected countries by climate change. In that area last year, we had one of the largest cyclones ever registered, and we had another one just a few hundred kilometers south. We had floods in the middle of the country and droughts in the south of the country. And even when we look at how we're dealing with this crisis, again, system fixes. We're looking at even the way the language is developed. A lot of the support we're getting in Mozambique is adaptation. What does that mean? I mean, you act, I adapt. There's a power relationship there. There's a situation where you have agency and I have to adapt to that agency. There's a disrespect. There's again, this power dynamics that's very fundamental to the system of accumulation, colonialism, and the current system that's dominating everything. And also, how can we anything, be it decolonize, anything, if we don't acknowledge our historic responsibility? Mozambique did not cause this. We had no role in the global crisis. But the North it's difficult we need to first acknowledge the mistakes we made, recognize the history of the problem. And if we can't even do that, how can we move to the next step? And that's of a fair share and all these other important issues. But also what crisis does is the system is so effective at even taking advantage of crisis. So, for example, the other project that I was going to be speaking about is Mabu Forest. So, the biggest, largest rainforest in southern Africa is Mabu. And there's 4 communities that live and that's basically there's 4 communities that are part of this ecosystem. And this is the territory, this is their land. And this wasn't the biggest tropical rainforest in southern Africa. If you go 20, 30 years ago, there were other bigger tracts, but the deforestation and illegal logging has been so bad that suddenly when people woke up and noticed, this forgotten piece had become the biggest. Okay, the communities in these areas were trying to make this the first community-managed forest. For 10 years, they were trying to get the rights to continue looking after and continue having it as home. And one of the things you notice, which comes back to something our keynote speaker mentions, is the valuing of traditional knowledge. So the first hurdle was all the technical bureaucratic steps that they needed to go through to be able to get formal recognition of something that is in the state it is because of their traditional practices. And that comes to the issue of even how we value things. For example, we know that traditional knowledge has a lot of value and is valid, but we then have to take it into our system of validation through science or other methods to give it true value and recognize it. So we have to basically legitimize indigenous knowledge in terms of Western science. and we have this inability to just value it and just acknowledge it as another form of knowledge, equal and just as valid, and have this diversity of systems of knowledge. No, we need to breed. It comes back to the markets, which comes back to climate change. The way we're looking at the problem is we're looking at the system of markets, and markets is basically saying that we know nature is valuable. We see how important it is to prevent ecological crisis, but we have to then transfer it into our systems of value, which is economic, give that a value, and then bring into our how we practice our monetary system, which is markets, for it to have a value. So in this system, a dead tree is more valuable than a live tree. Just the carbon is more important in the tree than all the rest of its functions, its history, its link with the people. It's crazy that we have a system that values a dead tree more than a living one, because it's either the wood or the carbon. Those are dominant valuing. And that's what. So what we have now is suddenly, because Attenborough, BBC went there, and suddenly the world knows, oh, this is an amazing, very precious, we need to protect it. So what have they done? EU made a huge competition for groups to come in and protect this area. And WWF won that competition. So just think about this. There's a group of NGOs, national NGOs, working for 10 years with local communities to make this a community managed forest. And suddenly, out of the blue, $1.something million, public competition, and it's given to a foreign big NGO without one consultation with the local community, without any interaction with people on the ground, people that call that them home. And now we're going to have this, and this comes back to a comment, which is this white savior situation. And also tells you conservation is basically admitting that we're failing because we need to make these little bubbles, these little islands of little Edens for the North to still have protect what they see as valuable and how they see it valuable and how they see the function of that, and their notion of what an ecosystem is and how it should be protected, and in completely ignoring the history, the local knowledge, and all that what's going on the ground. And they're looking, of course, red, which is a market-based, looking at trying to get money from the carbon value of the forest, and all these other ways of commodifying the value and trying to extract economic value out of it, and trying to manage the animal, the plants, and the people, and the criminalization of poverty, and all these factors just highlight how our system has to change. And I really liked the comment on. So basically, there was a really. So the white savior complex, and in response, and there was a comment that really stood out to me. Only people will save themselves. Nobody can outsource their liberation. That is, and this is critical. We have a group of individuals that have been part of this imbalance with this amazing place, that were in the process of protecting the way of life, of guaranteeing that they continue doing what they're doing, and we're taking that away under this umbrella of we're saving and conserving them. We're valuing the carbon. We're putting the markets, more economics into this, and that's where it comes down to when it's this is where I think there's nothing to fix. We have to be very careful when we look at this and try and find it. We have to look at a system level. And for me, there's a few things that I think will be good for us to consider and to have debates during this question and answer period. First of all, is how normalized a lot of these power structures and dynamics, the way we separate nature and how it is a tool for accumulation of wealth, how we decouple us and nature and our current system, how the hierarchy and the power dynamics. And it's so normalized that it's in our language, it's in our personal relationships, it's in our economy, it's everywhere. And it is really difficult. That's why it's so important that we have people that look in this in a deep way, and that we can have these spaces to have these debates. So for me, um, there is the system is, there's so much to discuss and so much to be done, and the diversity of knowledge and approaches and culture is really a strength that we haven't really tapped into. And even the way, for example, one of the things that is very clear when I work with a lot of the on the ground is even the climate crisis, who defines the biggest crisis, and it's so much knowledge in the way the climate crisis interpreted by some individuals on the ground in Mozambique, because this is a country that's been one of the most affected by climate. But I've heard a description in which they say climate crisis is a crisis of the privileged. Why? When your existence is only threatened when the global system collapses, means you're on top of the food chain, because our system is collapsing right now. I have lost my land. I've lost access to the ocean. I cannot fish. I cannot plant. I cannot feed myself and my family. That's today. That's what's happening with me today due to the way the system works. A climate crisis also indicates where you are on that on the hierarchy, and that's a problem. The fact that we have such inequality, and the inequality is too extreme, which at this moment we have less than 1% of the richest people in the world controlling more than 50% of the wealth. It is crazy the level of inequalities and accumulation that's happening, and that's something that I think is other areas I think we need to, because to go back to the main issue, which is decolonizing the ecology, it is really going down to the fundamentals of our value system. And the minute when we accept markets, what we're saying is our system, our culture, does not value anything other than money, than economics. That means we won't do something to save our planet, our people, our culture, unless we put a dollar sign. We need to sell it to save it. We need to put it to markets. We need to. And we're reinforcing this mentality, and we know it's not true. We know we value our value system so much more diverse. We value our home, our land, our culture, our people, and we just giving up on these because. And that's why we have to be careful. We have to be careful what these kind of approaches, these easy solutions, and the impact it has on the broader value system of our society. And as was mentioned, and especially some indigenous leaders have shown some amazing wisdom in how they describe the ignorance of our current system, the ignorance of what this will mean. We have to go back to our true values and the broad sense of values of our society, and to do any decolonization, anything, we need to first acknowledge our mistakes. We need to acknowledge our history. We need to acknowledge our values, and it comes back to something that's very, very present every day, and it's so true. And especially to me, because I'm a white male in Africa. Okay, I was born here. I've always lived here, but still, that comment is. I am a descendant of thousands of violent acts against indigenous people that translates to today's racial, political, and economic divisions. That comment is so true, and we can't run away from it. We should acknowledge it, we should be aware of it, and we should move forward with that present in what we do, we think, and so many more. So for me, I can go into more details on the specifics of the projects, the work, the struggles that we're having on the ground during the debate and all that. But just to go back to the beginning of the gas project, and when you go into this, and when you go into the details of how this project is playing out. So during this process, we realized a few things. First, the helicopters being used to bomb and to do military attacks came from France, the same way as Total is the main company pushing this forward. We are also one of the biggest corruption cases in Africa was Mozambique, in which was a huge scandal on purchases of vessels for fishing that end up being for military use to protect, again, the oil expansion. Another thing that in the process that people forget, one of the largest borders that Mozambique has is with France. That how crazy the current geopolitics are. If one looks at a slide, of Mozambique. So Mozambique, and then on the other side you had Madagascar, and in between that you had these tiny islands that no one lives there. But these islands have huge areas that these islands belong to France, and a huge part of the ocean around these islands belong to France. So our maritime border is longer with France than it is with Madagascar. And that tells you how present the shipping routes, the control of how things move, who controls what part, and all the dynamics are still so dominant. It's still functioning so similar to when it started many years. Like, it's not much has changed. And that's why we have to realize and go back to this. We have to look at the system and focus on system change and realize that there's nothing to fix. This is how the system works. This is how it will work. And it will work at all levels. That's why the first battle is with bodies. Like, women's body is the first battleground because it affects that level right through to your home, to your country, to your continent. It is the way the system works, and we need to acknowledge this. And that's something that I think I don't want to spend too much time, because I think we can have much more debates and questions and explore some of the details in that form. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the debate.
Thank you, Danielle, for that for your intervention, and thanks to both for these very interesting, really thought-provoking insights on what it means to decolonize ecology, some thoughts on the nature-culture divide, some of the contradictions that you've raised as well in the fields of policy making and advocacy. There's a lot of things to unpack here. And to discuss, and so I think I hope that I can be heard. I'm getting a message.
Yes, we hear you well.
Okay, great. So yeah, so there's a lot of things to unpack, and we have about 1 hour to have some kind of some discussion on some of these things. What we're talking really about is, in what ways then is ecology reinforcing potentially colonial imaginaries and material impacts on territory and cultural autonomy, or ways in it can actually conversely spur a decolonization of practice. So from the questions of the students and also from all of you, we can hope to provoke some conversation on this. And so I've basically kind of formulated some questions that come from the students, but also sort of contextualizing them a bit to propose to both speakers. I'm going to just start with an initial question. In terms of going to the real core of the debate or the discussion around decolonizing ecology, how does the way that you see decolonial ecologies, how does that differ from the sort of Western modern ecological science understanding of ecology, so ecological science? How can we distinguish a decolonial ecological approach to one that is the sort of ecological science in the hard sciences that is sort of the way that ecology is taught, let's say, and why is this distinction important? And I'm asking this question because fundamentally we're talking about different views on relationships here, between humans and non-humans, but also between humans and other humans, and how these are shaped historically by colonial legacies. So, Diana, maybe you have some thoughts on that? And just, sorry, one last point of intervention. Diana, before you say something, I will just, if you want to raise a question that you have, please check the link that Janos has just posted into the chat. You can it's the poll everywhere link, so there you can pose your question, and then we will have some time to look at the questions that sort of gain the highest ratings, and then we can collectively look at those questions together. Sorry, Diana, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. So your question will be in reference to what is the difference of what will be considered decolonial ecologies and Western European ecology, right? So I think the divide or the distinction between these two will have to be related to two things. One that I already mentioned is this division between what is considered this modern idea of what is nature versus what is society or human, right? And I think Jason Moore wrote it about. It's unbelievable that this division of nature separated from society has come in a time when the idea that we have a flat Earth was coming up. And so we have long time rejected with facts this idea that the Earth is flat, but we have not been able to dismantle also this very perverse division between human and nature, right? And I think we have not been able to do that because it's very utilitarian for the system conditions that present this idea that humans are the ones that are in control of nature, right? Humans are the one who can almost from a platform, upper platform, can control, can dominate, can usurpate and transform, commodify nature for their own wealth accumulation. And this other second idea that is, again, also very vicious, and that comes along with this dichotomy, it's also this idea that ecology as a discipline and therefore as the field of knowledge that gives us the insights to think about what we consider is nature and our relationships with nature comes from this very positivistic mind frame, right? That ecology, as any other natural science, is apolitical. So there is also this distinction between science being apolitical and not political because science needs to be objective. So if we turn out to be political, then we're not objective anymore, we're not neutral. But then I think it is a problem of definition, what we define as politics, right? And for me, politics is the way we govern our daily lives. So, and that starts on the way we create relationships in our daily lives, right? With our community, with families, in the place where we live. And so beyond what ecology could be as a discipline, creating or decolonizing relationships with nature or creating new ecologies, let's say, comes for decolonizing, we don't need to go, let's say, to Mexico to learn from what the Zapatistas are doing, right, and the relationship that they have with nature. Decolonizing our own ecologies means on getting to know our communities and the relationships we perform there with our neighbors. So, for example, if we have neighbors that are migrants, that are struggling to pay rent, how we can create an organization that supports each other, how we can create spaces to produce our own food, right, to serve ourselves with the needs that we need for our daily lives.
Thanks, Diana. Danielle, if you had some thoughts on that.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Sorry, it always asks for permission every time I put on the microphone. It comes for me, it goes back to, so nature, for example, whenever we have indigenous knowledge, even when we understand the value of indigenous knowledge, we always have to go through the current system of validation, meaning that we need to have, to legitimize indigenous knowledge, you need to have a Western scientific analysis and approach and then find the truth. I'll give you an example in Mozambique. If you go to the area, it's clear that the traditional practices are working. But for one of the requests that was needed was that we need to do an EIA, we need to do a land management plan. And so when we described, the community described their practices, it wasn't accepted as a management plan. So we have to get a group of scientists to come there and translate it, say the same thing, but with the Western scientific methodology approach and method things to validate what you can see. You can walk and live in it and see that it's working. Okay, but no, we have. So I think science is a very valid form of attaining truth and knowledge, as are other methods of attaining. I'm not telling. We have to be careful not to feed the opposite of we see a lot with the flat Earth and all that of trying to put science out of water. No, science. But the problem is we can't let science be the gatekeeper for other forms of knowledge, and that's what it's doing with traditional knowledge sometimes. We need the validation and the Western affirmation of, and so it doesn't matter if it's Eastern European, whatever the method is, until we can value something based on the value system and not translate it, transform it, and adapt it to our way of looking at values. The way we look at, like in the case of economics, we have to put a dollar sign on a tree to make it valuable. We don't need to. We cannot carry on finding ways of transferring into our value system, into our system, being our science, be it economics, being whatever. We have to be able to learn, and that's where our ignorance comes. We cannot see and understand the system well enough to be able to value it without having to translate it through our, and because the Western world has the power, we have the authority, and we then again dominating our way of looking at the world over everybody else because we want it to be seen in our lens, because we're too lazy to understand and trying to look at something from a different lens. We've been so normalized and so programmed to look at through this lens that we don't have, and that's why we're ignorant. And that's why we need to learn. We've been so programmed to look at through these very narrow lenses that we have to improve our ability to look at knowledge through indigenous lenses, and we don't know how to. We need to translate it always. We are the ignorant ones, and until we lose that ignorance, it will be very difficult for us to value it in the way that these other more diverse systems value it.
Yeah, thanks both. I think these both sort of nature-human separation and the sort of looking above, but also this sort of translation exercises and this idea of needing to validate what is already legitimate knowledge are both really interesting, ways of distinguishing this kind of decolonial approach to ecology from sort of the Western science approach. And related to that, and Danielle, you mentioned, how, a video by David Attenborough, that talked about the Mabu forest, that showed the imagery that went there, and then shortly afterward, a series of events came about in which this, that the EU was able to get support for this, and that the WWF won the competition to be able to put a natural reserve there. And it raises a question to me about, well, on the one hand, how the sort of Western approach, this Western lens of looking at conservation has such a powerful effect that it can negate, decades of management by communities that have been mobilizing there to establish rights on their land for so many years, can just be swept under the rug very quickly. And so my question is, we often see conservation as sort of the solution to counteract some of the negative impacts of an extractive economy that we have. So mining, oil, and gas, for example. And there are some conservationists who say we should rally around the idea of conserving half of the earth. Like E.O. Wilson, one of the most famous conservationists, has been arguing that we should identify the hotspots for conservation, delineate them, and safeguard them. But what you're kind of both articulating here is that conservation itself is a form of sounds like it is an extractive process when it negates those other worldviews. And so in this regard is a sort of colonial practice. And I wonder if communicating this to people could be seen to be counterintuitive or a bit of a shock to people. How can one communicate about the fact that conservation is in fact or could be very extractive? Diana, if you have some thoughts on that.
Daniel, maybe you want to go first.
Actually, Danielle, maybe you should go first since focus.
No, definitely, and it comes down to the conservation comes down again. It has to be, for me. It's definitely what you claim. It's definitely an extractive component, and this notion of E. Wilson of protecting the hotspots is these are homes to people. And I can tell you one thing, the most fierce protection comes from people that call the place home. Home, and that's the thing you have to understand, that you have to understand. And we need to make sure that we allow and we empower people to protect what they call home, the territories, what they call, and where they have the history, the ancestors, and all this. And that's why, and that's really, that is for me, conservation means that is conservation, because again, we only can conservation. This dichotomy between nature and society is the problem. We can't separate, and that's what we're doing. Continue. Okay, these are the hotspots of these little Edens. Let's protect these little Edens, and it's again protecting it for who? Why? Who's defining what's important in hotspots? It's just the problem is we are so far down the line in the decision-making process, and we're forgetting. Okay, wait a minute. What's our needs? Who are you asking? What are we asking? Who's participating in these decisions? All these things have been thrown out the water, and that's what crisis does. Crisis allows people to accept us to go further down the path because of urgency, and basically do what colonialism did, is that ignore indigenous people, ignore their decisions, their what they prioritize, what they think is important, what they've been doing, and what they've been protecting. We at the moment, we're not in a worse crisis because of them. Let's face it. The only reason why there's any chance of turning climate change is because of the indigenous people. And if that's not proof enough that we need to reinforce these value systems, then I don't think so. Yes, conservation is a problem because it's separating it, it's creating it, and it's deciding a lot of things right down the line without going through a due process and respecting that's home to people. We must not forget that. And it's their home. We knock, we ask permission to go in, and we and we follow by their rules, their culture, their values, and what they think is important. So straight away, the minute you step to any system that ignores these is a problem. It's distracting. You're distracting your interests, your wants, your desires, your solutions. And so anything can be extracted if we don't have the fundamental values and acknowledge whose home we're entering, what questions we're asking, who defines the priorities, the power to decide, the power of self-determination, and to move forward. And we have to respect that. And if we don't respect that, it's extractive. And that's the thing. So it doesn't matter if it's called conservationism, if it's called whatever it's called. If we leave the fundamental values of how we approach anything, it's extractive. It is abusive. It is disrespectful.
Diana, if you had something else to contribute, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think just to complement what Daniel said, I think the two things that he said, I think are very important. First, when we think about the way that conservation started, right, from the 70s, 80s to 90s especially, it is definitely a wide project, right? It is a very top-down idea that started with implementation of protected areas, especially in, as I said, in ex-colonies that are probably the places, the tropics, right, where most of the biodiversity hotspots are located. But those are top-down ideas that came from foreigners, white foreigners, that were implemented, and basically what represented was another form of land enclosure, right? Because again, it was a reinforcement of this idea that in order to protect this space of land, this ecosystem, this forest, whatever it was, we need to remove all the people living there that for hundreds of years they have living there. And in order to do that, we'll just displace them. We don't care about them. We don't care what will happen to them, to their futures, to their culture. We only care about protecting this empty space of land. When we see for hundreds of years, humans have lived in all ecosystems. Like it is known that this idea, for example, of the Amazonia as this wilderness space, it is no longer that. Humans have lived for hundreds of years there, and they have lived in a different relationship that they have created with this nature, respecting the cycles, respecting the environment, because they are pretty much part of that. So I think, again, this also comes for an idea that Daniel also talked about. When we think about conservation, or starting again, going back to your previous question of what is ecology, when we turn as a form of wide project that comes from Western societies, from European ideas, we tend to reject other forms of knowledge because that is not considered science, right? So in order to implement any solution that we have, we only need to listen to the facts and need to listen to the scientists. So any other form of knowledge that doesn't follow within that specific description that we have is not worth it to take into consideration. And that has not only have become a way of discrimination, but now we see that we have rejected like really critical information that we have in order to conserve and to fight in this climate crisis that we have.
Yeah, I guess related to what you're saying, Diana, as well, sort of this project that came from a sort of from this European and sort of this white supremacist view. Even, I mean, we can clearly say that as well, if it is really about sort of extracting and the violence, the oppression that is created on indigenous people and the cultural genocide that has resulted from that. So you mentioned in your when you spoke about world ecology and how you were inspired by the work of historian Jason Moore. It's interesting because he writes that we can't really look at social and environmental crises as symptoms of capitalism, of development, but as constitutive of it, meaning that capitalism is in fact an ecological regime. It is an ecological, it is an ecology on its own. It's so as world ecology as you described. So what if that is if sort of a decolonial ecology would be clearly anti-capitalist, how then can this be, how does this vision clearly contradict with the approaches that are being adopted through multilateral mechanisms to address the crises that we are facing? And I'm thinking, as diverse as they seek to be, I'm thinking about strategies like the Sustainable Development Goals that are so committed to ideas of decoupling environmental or ecological crises and breakdown from growth.
Yeah, so I think the Sustainable Development Goals are quite of benevolent efforts to try to tackle unsustainable development worldwide, right? But I think, again, going back to this idea of, first, let's start who is designing these policies? Again, where are these policies coming from, and where these policies are going to be implemented, right? I think they are better than last time was the what is MDG, what I forgot what it stands for.
The Millennium Development Goals?
Yeah, the Millennial Development Goals. They were only tackled for developing countries, right? Again, like the idea of we need to save these countries, we need to help them because they are not able to help themselves. And so at least the Sustainable Development Goals tackled all the countries because, again, the problem is in all countries and we all have to come together unified. But the problem, again, is that first it comes with the idea of development. And again, in decolonization studies, the whole concept of development has been problematic. Indigenous groups have challenged this concept because for them, the whole idea of development being implemented in their territories has been the cause for land dispossession and the erasure of their lives. So the whole idea of what development means and if they want development or not. And the second thing, as I said, those are top-down measures that come probably from outside, probably from a few people, scientists, policymakers that come and say, we know what you need to do to save your life. And so to the people that receive that type of help and the ones that actually need the development goals are going to tackle the most the marginalized groups. But at the same time, the needs and the voices of those marginalized groups are not being heard. So we don't really know what they are demanding or claiming. And the third thing, I think it is the problem also with the Sustainable Development Goals I see is that even though they are global efforts, the measures are within self-contained countries, right? So we have the SDG in Norway, we have the SDG in Mexico, we have the SDG in India. Every country has their own measures, right? The problem with that is that we don't see how there are global interdependencies that depend on the capital flows that we're having now. Again, the demand of the system of production and consumption that is very globalized, and also the patterns of migration of people that are having. If we don't consider the global consequences and the trade-offs that we have, then I don't know how much we can tackle in terms of really just climate efforts to tackle sustainable development, right?
Mm-hmm. Danielle, I don't know if you want to intervene as well with that question.
I might go a bit off topic, but so for me, there's a few issues that I've found with a lot of these initiatives. One is the corporate capture of these spaces and how small manipulations of these processes, these goals, can make huge differences. And we see that in the climate, the UNFCCC, we see that in the COPs, we see that, and it's amazing how this few tweaks, it's almost like a chain. You just need to break one small link and everything falls. And that's what the system's really good at doing. And for example, with climate, you have, we need to reduce emissions. And suddenly you have this carbon neutral, which means that you can transfer your emission load somewhere else, and you can just get the output of that emission load, and you still meet your targets. And I've noticed that with these goals, and another thing is being goal-orientated and having this direction. And it reminds me of my work in a way, because if I had to be goal-orientated in my work to a certain extent, it'll be very depressing. Because if you're doing something first of all, you have to be quite arrogant to think you can save the world. It's ridiculous to think that you have that ability or that aspiration. The other thing is that you lose so many battles that, and most of the times you're fighting much bigger powers and structures than you. So you do what you do because it's the right thing to do. It's not a goal. It's not, I don't have a finish line, and we shouldn't have a finish line. It's the process. It's the day-to-day. What should we do? What's your contribution to society that can make society a better place, and not what you can achieve and where you get to there. Let fate decide that. Just go along. And that's the thing with goals. Goals is we focus, and once you put a goal, we open up options of shortcuts to that goal, manipulation to those goals. I'll give you an example, Mozambique. We had, at one time, 7% access to electricity, 7%. It went to 14, and now it's 20-something% access to electricity. Part of this growth was true dealing with energy poverty. Another one was manipulation of the methods. Before, any transport point, they only made connections of a certain distance. So what they said is, okay, let's change that. So now, if we say that this transfer station, we're willing to make connections up to X radius, everybody in that radius is considered to have access to electricity. But for you to be able to actually link to this power station, this access point, you need to pay for the connection, the transfer, and all the infrastructure. But there's no infrastructure. But technically, we went up a big chunk just by manipulating what we consider as access. First, everybody in Maputo is considered to have access. Why? If you pay, you have. So the way you define access, you have suddenly go from 7 to 14. The way you define what is the radius that is considered to be part of that infrastructure, even if there's no infrastructure, but you're willing if you pay because there's a method to get it. So suddenly Mozambique met its energy needs, its access to electricity and dealing with energy poverty through a big chunk of it, manipulations and changes to the methodology and the way you define things, semantics. And that's the problem with goals, because if you don't have values, if you don't have deeper principles and then these like little finish lines, you have a lot of manipulation and shortcuts. And so for me, those two aspects that we still have to really look at is the corporate capture and how the power structures weaken and all that, and how goal-based only our objectives can be very easily manipulated, and we can achieve that through shortcuts and cheating without dealing with the real issues of the society. And that's why, again, I'm not saying to throw it, I'm not saying there's no value in it, but we need to be aware of it. We also have to change some fundamentals in how we see success. At the moment, the most dominant way of seeing success is economic growth. It's still the dominant. Whatever carrot we put in front of society, it's the direction we're going to go. And we need to be more diverse in what we see as a successful country, what we value, what we see as, and it's more than just putting out these little targets. Because how do we get to that target? Energy poverty. We deal with a centralized, big multinational that, and we can get, and also even alternative energies. We have these huge solar power stations that solar fields that take away community land. Wind was a clean energy, but it powered slavery. And that's kind of what we have to realize is that these goals can be achieved in a diversity way, and the system that we achieve these goals is as important as the goals that we achieve. And sometimes these goals don't focus on how we're getting. Is it people powered? Is it decentralized? Is it locally owned? All these things are not requirements for these goals. And that means we do not put in values in our goals. We're putting just, hey, here's a race. Shoot the gun and hope we can make it. It's like there has to be a deeper analysis, a deeper component to these approaches. And instead of this carrot approach, that's for me at least. As again, I work on the ground on campaigns. I'm not a policy developer or anything. It's just my opinion of what I see in these areas.
So Daniel, you mentioned their technology, and I think that's also an interesting intervention as well, because renewable technologies, wind power, as you say, are often billed as green and are billed within the same gamut of sort of taking an ecological approach to development, greening development. But technology, obviously doesn't come out of the air. It is, in fact, a part of, as you've already discussed, the material and energy use that is required over the labor that is required, the land, the territory, all of that. So in terms of being attentive to relationships between humans and each other and non-humans, my question is, does technological advancement sort of change or maintain colonial relationships rooted in land dispossession? Can we think of sort of other indigenous technologies or other forms of knowledge systems that could also be viewed as technologies that produce or change sort of ecological relations differently? Produce ecological relations differently, I should say.
No, definitely technology can exacerbate, especially based on the system that you put it in. Like at this moment, you have ownership of technology, you have patents, who controls technology, the right to use of that technology. This is a system of ownership, and that's a problem. We need to use usership. We don't look at usership. We look at ownership, and it's not who developed the technology. It's the first one to get to registering the technology. So a lot of patents. We are patenting genomes of animals from other countries. So you have there's companies that own genetic genomes of species that in the South. That's ridiculous. So technology, it's a tool. It's a hammer. I can use a hammer to build or to break. It's for me in this moment, because we know the values of the system, how it works, we can project where it's going to go. So for me, technology, again, it has to be embedded into a value system. If we're going to use, and so also because in the North, the main crisis is no longer access. It's the impact of the technology. So if you can get it to be clean, a big chunk of the problem satisfies the needs of the mass. In the South, we still have energy poverty. We still have to give energy and make it socially fair, socially just. So there's a more complex process to that. And that's why, for me, having a solar field that's going to depossess communities from land is problematic. And if it's a technology that's controlled, centralized from the North, owned by the North, that's going to be based on economic system, it has to be profitable and all this, there's going to be major problems. So for me, again, whatever you build, the foundation is important. The foundation of values that you have is very important. And we need to start questioning the value systems we have in our society and diversify it and use examples from elsewhere to be able to get there. And I can speak a bit more about it, but I think I'll give Diana a chance to comment.
No, you can go ahead.
So for me, sorry.
Daniel, I think you had something you wanted to complete there. Go ahead.
I know it's again about, for me, when I see technology and all that, it comes back to the old issue of there's so much, like I'll give you example of Mabu. A lot of the practices that that are being carried out there is technically agroecology. So the coining and the terminology and all these things, and that's what I think. The control of the narrative, the control of the story, the control of who popularize it, the access and the transition of these stories, these knowledges, and the channels it has to go through to reach the broader public is still controlled. And it's hard to get through that labyrinth without it being grabbed, taken, owned, patented. And that's another problem, is these pathways, and who controls these pathways of knowledge, and how knowledge spreads throughout our system. And we have good examples, and you can find examples everywhere. For example, in software, we have open source. We have a group of people that make programs and software for people to use. It's not only open source, because within open source you have different things, but there is a community within that's very much developing a lot of these things. So we have systems which they're doing it for other reasons other than economics and all that. So I think there's a lot of examples, not only that we can use and try and replicate elsewhere, but there's no interest. There's a threat, because we need the control of, at this moment, what I feel is we have a lot of the power of decision making is in the hands of the people that have benefited from the system. And even with good intentions, it's amazing the subconscious ability of protecting the hand that feeds you. And you're living proof that a system works, but it works for you, which is a small minority. And often when I find myself talking about some of the solutions that come from academics and the North, is I see good people with good intentions, and it's really hard to break that privilege barrier and this link and all this. And but anyway, as I said, we can go more topics. And for me, technology as well is the techno fix is an issue for me sometimes, because it simplifies the true problem of the issue. This techno fix, technology will save us. Solutions like the ingenuity, like we have this over belief that we're very arrogant as a species, and we have this ability, our minds will solve everything, and technology will fix it. And it actually causes a lot of barriers in really dealing with the bit deeper issues. And that's why I see technology and the techno fixes, it's dangerous, and we need to understand the deeper issues.
Diana, I don't know if you had something to add to that. I'm also conscious of the time as well, so we can go to the poll questions, but go ahead.
No, just very briefly, I agree with last point of Daniel's of this idea of technofix, because I think I'm not saying that it is important, for example, to reach to a point of energy transition for all societies, right? But in that regards, we need to question always, for any policy, who is benefiting and who is losing, right? Who wins and who loses. And so if in this idea of techno fixes that Daniel is mentioning, if we're benefiting the community, then it's one thing. But if we're benefiting corporations that are only producing income and value for benefiting themselves, then we have to ask, is it even worth it to go that way? Are we justifying this idea of environmental improvements or sustainable development through these ideas of the technology will save, when we are actually not tackling the root of the problem, which is the injustices that we are creating in itself?
Yes, thank you, Diana and Daniel, for those responses to the student questions. And so we can go ahead to look at the poll. And just looking at the poll now from the audience, I see that the question that has the most that's rated quite high is going to Diana. And it states, Diana said, decolonization is not about a critique on modernity or on European society. But isn't it a necessity to dismantle and drastically change European institutions and change the Eurocentric system in order to fully be able to achieve decolonization?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I agree with whoever put that question. My point is, I think decoloniality or decolonization becomes problematic, and I think that is only a misinterpretation or misunderstanding of what decolonization really means, is when we put two systems of knowledge to pit against each other. It's not that, oh, because I'm decolonial or because I'm decolonizing, then I absolutely reject the Western society way of living, way of thinking, because I think that actually creates another dichotomy that is not very helpful for us to find actually a meaningful dialogue between different groups of society, different societies that need to tackle, again, global phenomenons, right? So again, like I said, it is not about the need to import knowledge because society is capable and able to create their own solutions, to create their own proposals. That's what I'm saying. There is no single way of thinking that is the best way. There is no blueprint, right? We need to have plural ways of understanding. So, for example, degrowth, that is inherently an Eurocentric Western form of seeing the society, I think it works. And I see actually it helps to create this society that dismantle these hegemonic power structures. So there's no way I can oppose that and say, oh no, I reject this idea because it comes from the Western world, right?
Thanks, Diana. Danielle, I don't know if you had some additional thoughts on that.
No, it's well put by Diana. It's the end of the day, it's giving value to all systems of knowledge. So it's not if a good solution comes from the West, the East, the South. It's just giving the same fair judgment, the same value from all this, and actually giving a level playing field and allow that diversity of cultures, ideas, solutions, ways of looking at things to interact and come up with the best option and see what comes out. So it's not about focusing at this moment. We have one system that's oppressing the others, but doesn't mean we don't want to replicate the same powers and use these tools to break down something because we're then propagating those values. We need to be able to respect even the dominant system, but probably have to take away the dominance of that system. We need to be able to have it's a leveling playing field. It's for me. We have a system that's really preventing a big diversity of solutions from different places to come up, and we need to just create that equal space. It's like balancing the playing field. It's breaking down these power relations. And don't forget the system. The system also has transferred a lot of its costs to work to, if you look at this, like for example, especially with the COVID situation, healthcare, where does it fall? On women. Where does the responsibility of climate change fall? On indigenous people. So the system is not balanced and it transfers these imbalances to specific minority groups. And therefore we need to be able to break these systems of oppression, patriarchy, be what it may, and so because if all these different groups are given equal power, you multiply the power. At the moment, you have one single focus of power, and we're losing a lot of opportunity everywhere else. And that's something that I think is more where I would go with this. Not that we have to, of course, we need to fight this, but again, it's not about just. There is a process in how we create that equal playing field.
Mm-hmm. So, Diana, you mentioned degrowth, and that's actually one of the questions, another question that somebody from the public has raised, stating that degrowth has increasingly been invoked in European countries as a means to achieve well-being and a life premised on enoughness and in sharing abundance rather than endlessly proliferating profit and growth logics. To what extent is degrowth a strategy towards decolonization and decolonizing Western? And I think there might have been more to that sentence, but it got cut off. I guess link the strategy of degrowth as efforts towards decolonization. You've sort of alluded to that, but what are there any drawbacks as well, just to add to that? I mean, is there anything that degrowth or moving towards degrowth can, moving towards decolonization, but also detract from that?
Right. Well, to be honest, I have my level of skepticism of degrowth, not because I don't support for Western society, for Western industrialized rich societies, right? Because my framework of thinking comes again from the place I'm coming from, and there I'm not sure if degrowth is the proper way to go, right? Again, we had to point at the level of affluence and consumption that comes from upper class in developing countries. Again, Latin America, for example, is the region with the most inequality. Poor being really poor and rich people being super rich. And the level of consumption of the super rich people there is probably much more than an average consumption of any citizen here in Europe, right? So again, like I have troubles there, but I definitely support degrowth for rich, developed, industrialized societies. And to the extent of how much degrowth can help on a decolonial call, I think it goes to the extent of how it can actually put in dialogue with other demands coming from other groups that are calling for Black Lives Matter, for example, or calling for migrants' rights, or calling for indigenous recognition of their lands, or calling for just transitions where they recognize the diversity of demands coming from marginalized groups.
Daniel, I don't know if you had something as well on that.
Yeah, I'm in line with Diana's comments. For me, what I like about degrowth and the general philosophy and ideas that are coming out, it is diversifying how we judge a society. We're not judging it, as I said before, it's like we're judging it by other social aspects, you see, and social aspects, and also defines what we consider as what are rights. If you have a good foundation of what are basic rights, so you have this baseline that we consider, and we keep those within the public spaces. We're not like privatization of healthcare, education, all these different things. It's for me, it comes back to the system to. What I like about growth, the degrowth, is the capitalist system to work needs to constantly grab parts that are in the public space into its economy to continue growing. It needs to continue to feed, and we've seen this with the privatization, and now we're going to commodification of nature, green economy, and all this stuff. And it's a good narrative to try and push back. We need as many narratives and alternative views to push back at these kind of approaches. But then again, is this idea, for me, what happens is the idea has potential, and it has potential because it came from a place, it has a context, it has a reality, which is Europe, and it works for that context. Now, the next step is, how do we transfer these ideas, and are they going to be sent down south, and how are they going to be sent down south? How are they going to be used? How are they manipulated? So my problem is, ideas work because they come from a place, from an area, from a context, from a reality. And sometimes you have to realize that those ideas, it's good, but it might only work in one place. We have this notion that we have to globalize. It's good, work, just globalize everywhere, send it everywhere. And we have to realize that sometimes the solution's for here, that solution's for there, and we cannot scale up. There's this notion of, hey, it works, let's scale it up. There is a context, a history, a reality for solutions. And we have to sometimes leave solutions for certain areas, other solutions to other areas, and allow for diversity and not the scale up. And that's for me where growth could be one of these aspects where it is there's a lot of potential in the context, in the place it's come from, and it makes sense, and all that in that. And we have to be careful on not trying to export these ideas and push it around and manipulate them. But I like how it's create a debate around and diversification of how we value our society and how we judge the success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting because the plurality of potential degrowth alternatives, or whatever language we want to use, we don't need to say degrowth even, that are coming from different places in the South, from all over the world, are legitimate in their own ways of sort of resisting and reclaiming a different kind of path, and even the invocation of degrowth, we have to be very careful, that we are not recentering Europe in that process, and the sort of European way of thinking about how to respond from their particular context and from their particular setting. I see one question as well that's directed specifically to Danielle, in which someone is asking if you could elaborate a bit more on the link between recent extremist attacks in northern Mozambique and socio-ecological breakdown.
Yeah, definitely. This is more within my work. So I have to try and be short. The problem is when you work a lot on something, it's hard to be short. I like to just make a quick intro to the problem. So in Mozambique, a lot of land is central to all of this, as it's always. And that's why if one looks at, for you to get into any state of like economic power, the first step is political, in which you get a district or administrative post somewhere. That gives you access to land, and you have the ability to get land into the economic system. Your input, your commodity in the investment, your shareholder status comes from access to land for investors. In Mozambique, there's a lot of monocultures, a lot of intensive land, big agribusiness and stuff like this, and of course, mining concessions and all that. Once you get economic power, you translate it into political power, you translate economic power, and then you go up the ladder economically. Why is this important? This has been the step, and this process has depossessed a lot of communities from land. There's been land grab has been a big issue in Mozambique. So in the north, especially, where there's a lot of resources, it's where they have most rainfall, the most fertile soil. So there's a huge land grab problem. And in the community in Mozambique, at a national level, more than 70% are subsistence farmers, fisher folk. In that province, it's more than 80%. And we have a failing education system, because we were a communist country in civil war until '92. So we suddenly go to this rapid capitalism, like when the communist countries fell. So this caused this uncontrolled capitalism that caused the breaking down of the education system. So we have over 50% illiteracy and people losing the land. So we have a lot of youth that don't have land, don't have jobs, don't have skill sets for the opportunities in urban, even for the urban setup. And so that has created a big demographic of individuals and then when they try and raise their voice, they're oppressed by the government. Okay, so you're not allowing people to join, create movements, because the ability to deal with the problems that face you is important. It allows you to be hopeful, it allows you to be constructive. And when you take that away, you have this notion, and that's why the government has created a breeding ground for narratives. When you have this hopelessness, this frustration, this anger, you've been disrespected, dispossessed, landless, and you're very open to these forms of extremist narratives. And that's what's happening in Mozambique. We've created decades of abuse to the point where people, and people have to realize that before we criminalize these, that the crimes are atrocious, but we have to understand no one goes on this path unless they've been pushed to the edge. And we have to understand all our roles in pushing these individuals to that point of extremism. And that's why it's very important to understand this. And it's Islamic extremism, but it could have been tribalism. There was a lot of tribal conflict. What was lucky in Mozambique is that tribal leaders decided to control this and create understanding between them. They could have had, if they wanted to, they could have taken it down tribal extremism. You could have had tribal conflict if you wanted to, if the leadership decided to go down that path. We could have had, it's not what type of extremism, it's more of an indication of people are desperate and they're more open to these types of extreme philosophy because everything else has failed. And the failure is strongly linked to extractivism. It's strongly linked to the way the system has taken the resources, extracted the minerals, extracted the value, what they consider economic value that's in that system, completely destroyed the system, dispossessed the people, and left them abandoned with nothing. And so that's, for me, why whenever we talk about extremism, I always have hesitated. It's unfair to do that without looking at why people are doing this, the background. The problem is we cannot simplify narratives. We have to put the full story, understand our role in it. And the North has a lot of role because it's Total. It's a French company making millions. So the blood the blood that's been done both by the military, by the extremists, is a link to all of us. And we cannot run away from it. I know it doesn't feel comfortable, and just saying it's extremism is simplifying and making it easier to forget how we are linked to all of this. So for me, that's a very simple way of saying why we're having the conflict we do in that area. And what makes it worse is that you have a snowball effect, because now you have the government suddenly increasing militarization. So what we had is suddenly the government did forced recruitment, fast-tracked training, and didn't vet what type of individuals they're giving military power to. So you had this influx of very young, inexperienced, badly trained, and with individuals there with tendencies that should never be given power, suddenly in an area, and of course what happens, you have rape, you have abuse, you have violence, you have the military being, and also you're given a reason, there's now a scenario to be heavy-handed militarily and use this narrative to oppress true community leadership, community initiatives, and activists and journalists that are trying to raise the truth. But now the militarization allows you to use this scenario, so it's a snowball effect in which it's getting out of control, and that's a sad reality. We have a staff member that in May had to be evacuated from the area because he got death threats. Him, his wife, and 5 kids had to be left, and he's now, the family's still somewhere else in another province, and he's still going back 3 weeks in Palma in the area, 1 week with the family, and we forget that it's at individuals. It's not justiça ambiental. It's individual. At the end of the day, we forget that whatever institution we have above us, whatever name he's the one that's going back into the area of danger, getting the stories, getting the narratives, and coming out and continue going back and forth, even after he got death threats, after his family had evacuation, and his family's living somewhere else. And we forget the nuances of what it means to work in an area that's under extremist conflict, under heavy militarization, to produce wealth for the most wealthy part of one of the most wealthy countries in the world. And we allow this to continue. It's still normal. It's still the norm, with EIAs, with all these nice, pretty system fixes. And that's something that I sorry.
Yeah, Daniel, just to, we're coming very close to the end here. What you just described, though, it reminds me a little of the sort of demonization of poachers as well, for the same, for conservation initiatives, how we don't look at the conditions that are leading people to have to poach to make a living. And in the process, that the sort of approach of conservation in that sense is doing a similar kind of thing. So it's interesting, just making that link there. Diana, go ahead.
Sorry, not a question, but I think it is important, this point to raise, and unfortunately we won't have much time to talk about that. But I think it also links to the level of militarization of conservation that closes really to this idea of fascist environmentalism that is dangerously growing all over the place, right? And I think it tackles the idea that pretty much comes now, COVID again has become the perfect justification to blame the population, right? The population is the virus, the humanity is the virus. The humanity is the ones that have we are the guilty ones that have produced all this damage to, again, the poor wild nature. And I think this is becoming much more dangerous because it leads to these policies that come with militarization, with the blaming to the poor, marginalized people. And it is actually becoming more strongly because we see that important leaders of really representative countries are adopting these dialogues, are adopting this way of thinking, right? We have Donald Trump, a climate denier. We have Jair Bolsonaro that is killing, exterminating indigenous people in the Amazonian. And we have all over the place this idea in Europe as well that is coming, and it's very dangerous, and we need to seriously call it.
So with that point, I'm going to end the discussion here. So I take the awkward moment of clapping to myself, but of course to you, both of you, and
thank you very much.
And yeah, just a very rich, wonderful discussion that was had, and just a note, also a thanks to all those who have been involved in this behind the scenes. as well as to the full audience, of course, for participating. So just a note that the recording, that this event was recorded and it will be published on the website shortly. And also a note that there will be a short and very informal debriefing session on what we've heard today, tomorrow at 8 p.m. Central European Time. In case anyone is interested in joining, I believe Yanis has provided the registration link in the chat. And next week's debate will take place at the same day, same time, and is entitled "A Decolonial Turn for Development Studies" as a question, with Sarello Ndlovu Gacheni, chair in epistemology of the Global South at the University of Beirut, and Johan Bastiansen, who is the chair of the Institute of Development Policy here at the University of Antwerp. And you can see as well in the following weeks there are additional webinars that will be taking place. So please check the website for updated links on the registration form, as they're not always already available. So with that, I thank you all, and yep, take care. Have a good evening. Or
Thank you very much, everyone. Really learned a lot. Thanks.
Thank you, Vijay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
bye.
Thank you, Diana.
Is that it?